So hello, Robbie and Anna of Ritual Chocolate. Great to be talking to you this morning. I wanted to get started with just a real quick background about how you got into chocolate. Where did you come from, and why were you compelled to start making chocolate?
Well, you know, it's sort of something that happened gradually. We wanted to start a business, and the idea of chocolate came, which we both, we both love chocolate, but we knew very little about it. And just through research about the process and source of beans, it's really fascinating, and it's something where you've really got to dig around to find the information. But for us, we just, once you get in there, it kind of hooks you, and we just really became very passionate about it. It's really exciting to be involved. But I think for both of us, neither of us have any sort of culinary background. I think I was working for a lawyer and a sports agent. But I think for me, something that kind of drew me in, it's sort of a strange parallel, but my dad is a farmer, and sort of in the family. And I think seeing, kind of growing up around that, where your work is a lifestyle, and it's very much, sort of, you're immersed in it, and you're working with your hands, and I guess farming in a way could be considered a craft or a skill. And,
Right.
So it was sort of this strange connection that I had, and I think part of why I found the farming side was so interesting, because I'm just sort of growing up on the farm, so that was part of it for me.
And I was a writer for a cycling magazine before I got into chocolate, which is a strange segue, but it's I actually wrote an article about coffees that are marketed towards cyclists, which there are a bunch, which you might not know of, but
The actual beverages or coffee-based products?
coffee, like actual coffee, like you see a lot of retired cyclists starting coffee roasting companies, or moving to Hawaii and starting their own farm. And it's just, for some reason, it's in the cycling community. So I decided to do a side-by-side cupping with about 15 of these companies to see which ones were actually good, and that kind of opened my eyes. We were both there, so it opened our eyes to sort of the potential with something like coffee, and we were into chocolate before that, and so but only just as something that we enjoyed. But I wouldn't say we were connoisseurs or anything. But then we made the connection between what coffee was doing and what could be done with chocolate. And also, candy making is in my blood for 4 generations now. So that was kind of also a natural step to take. My mom worked in my grandpa's candy factory, and my grandpa worked in his dad's candy factory, and my great-grandma was a chocolatier. So it goes back. It's just, it was never something I thought I would do, but it...
You've been sucked in.
Sucked in. It was fate.
Came around.
Even when we got started, I wasn't thinking, my mom, and my grandpa, and my great-grandpa. I wasn't thinking about them when we got started.
Yeah.
But then I realized, I've been looking at these photos and talking about it with the family for forever, and it just only made sense to sort of be following the footsteps a little bit.
Where was your family based out of in terms of the candy making and chocolatier?
Salt Lake initially, but then my grandpa and grandma moved to Manhattan Beach, California for a while, and started another candy business there, and then they sold it and retired. It's both Utah and California.
Interesting. It's funny that you say that you came from a strange place to then segue into chocolate, but that's not strange at all, it seems, in the craft chocolate making industry. It's certainly not even strange in terms of, if I look at where I come from, I'm a molecular biologist who was doing medical research, and now I'm in chocolate, obvious next career step. But somehow, like you say, as you're going down this path, suddenly you're in it, and then you realize, oh, this totally makes sense. There was all this stuff leading me here, and it wasn't a conscious thing, but you get there. So
Exactly.
Anyway, yeah.
I was a geology major in college, and shear force and crystal formation and all this stuff.
All the time, he's like.
I'm always using like these geology terms and like even math equations sometimes for figuring out shear force and things like that.
Yeah, and like for tempering and crystal structure and all that kind of stuff, you're bringing that in.
Yep. So it's all connected.
That's good. You can always, convince your parents that your degrees weren't wasted because you're still using them in a way that no one would have imagined. So you're based out of Denver, Colorado, and you started up in, you were telling me, like May of 2009, so you've been working on the chocolate since then. And the other thing that's kind of interesting about you too is that you're working at it as a couple. So there's, lots of new chocolate makers coming online, but I think a lot of them are maybe in some ways more solitary or sort of working on their own and kind of these creative geniuses. And so it's interesting to see the two of you come together and work. And I'm curious how's that working out?
Well, two people is better than one, we always say.
Yeah, I feel like you need a partner in this. It's so much work. I mean, even for the two of us, we don't have music. It's so much.
And if you're going to be spending 18 hours a day with your work, it might as well be.
Be sure you like it.
You gotta be sure you like it.
Right. Yeah, and if you weren't actually working on the same project together, you might be really annoyed with one another for working so hard on your job. So that works out.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. When we first started, we're like, okay, when we go out to dinner, we're just not going to talk about the business. We've got to make sure we have our time. And now it's like, we go out to dinner, we're like, great, we haven't changed this project. We don't even think about it, we're talking about it.
Right.
Awesome.
That's what we're interested in. It's great. We sort of inspire each other.
That's great. So tell me, the bar that we're going to feature this weekend at the Farmers Market is your 75% Costa Rica. Can you tell me a little bit, like which region of Costa Rica the beans are from, and then just touch on, I think one of the things that's really interesting to me is the idea that, a lot of the folks who taste this chocolate know that cacao is fermented and then it's dried. And in talking to Steve earlier this year, and he really educated me around the fact that maybe we should be calling this process curing. A lot of times, certain high quality cacao is actually being cured, and there's specific ways to dry that really impact the flavor. Can you speak to that?
Well, first of all, the thing with our Costa Rican bar is it's kind of alone out there in the chocolate world in terms of something to compare it to, except for Steve DeVries, of course, because we use the same beans from Costa Rica, which he sun-dried with the sort of Chihuahua method, is what you might call it. But it's going to be very different from anything else from Costa Rica. I mean, there's the co-op down south, Apto, which is where like a company like Theo gets their beans from. That's going to be totally different. There's Upala up north, where a lot of other makers get their beans from. They're processed by the same farm that we get our beans from, but it's grown elsewhere. So when you taste like different Costa Ricans side by side, ours is going to be a lot different just because it is just completely different beans. There's nothing to really compare it to. But you do get, it's a very tannin-rich bar. What else? It's a very wine-like kind of finish, kind of rainwater finish.
And I mean, I really think that that's for the most part because of the way Steve dried it. It's a very slow drying method, and you're only, as with most farms that sun dry, they just put it out in the sun all day and turn it. But this is much more methodical. It's a very slow process. You're putting it out maybe for a few hours, bringing it back in, and so it's a slow development of the flavour, and it makes for a very different chocolate. And I think perhaps that's where the industry will go, because I feel like there's so much that can be done with finished chocolate flavour from how the beans are dried. That really, that's something that it's really interesting that I think will be explored more, and we certainly would like to explore it more in the future and get down there.
Because we've had beans from the same farm. It's just north of Guapiles on a dirt road for about 45 minutes. It's called Finmac, and we've had beans from that farm that were fermented and dried the way they do it. We've had beans the way that Steve has done it, and you wouldn't even know they were from the same. You wouldn't even know they were from the same farm.
Yeah.
I mean, really, the only thing they had in common was their kind of earthy Costa Rica flavor, which is pretty common. But I mean, with the drying, I mean, you look at somewhere like Chihuahua. Chihuahua's reputation comes from a single plantation for the most part. But then there is a region which a lot of beans sell as Chihuahua. And I think a lot of those beans get sold as Chihuahua. People buy them and think, it's pretty good. And that's because they're not getting the specific beans from this specific plantation which dry in this specific way. Because all the genetics are actually the same in that area for the most part. So you'd think it'd be all the same, but if you're not getting from the right farm, the drying's not right, and you won't get the Chihuahua you always dreamed of.
Right. So I mean, really, it's interesting. The question is like Chihuahua is sort of considered one of the best regions, and is it because of the genetic type, or is it just because of the drying methods? I mean, it's really fascinating. I think that's something that's just coming to light. It just opens things up for everyone.
Well, it's just like wine. Terroir isn't always about region. It's about what they've done in that region for years in terms of when they harvest, how they age their wine, how they do what they do.
Right.
What temperature they store it at. All these little things. Terroir is as much about soil and climate as it is about the people behind it. So.
Right. Well, it's interesting you say, that in the future you think that this will be something that people will explore, and I think that if we can get to the place where I think it has to happen across the supply chain, and that people who taste have to understand what are the steps that make this bar fantastic, and then then the makers can also then reward the farmers for that kind of careful curing, because it's very time consuming and a lot of labor to drag these beans in and out, as I've read happens in Chihuahua, so that they can sort of steepen their juices and the astringencies can come out, and so that's a lot more work than just plunking those beans out and letting them sun dry quickly.
Well, yeah, it's a lot more work actually, because you're instead of just putting them out, you are putting them out for 3 hours and then heating them back up, and then the next day spreading them back out and heating it back up, and then the third day you do the same thing for a little bit longer, and the fourth, fifth, and sixth days you leave them out a little bit longer and try to finish the dry. But it's all about getting the right acids out and keeping the good ones in. It's just
and getting the right humidity levels and doing that. I guess typically the harvest would be in the spring, so it's kind of a moist time. Are there issues of rain and that sort of thing as well?
Definitely. Yeah, that's a whole other problem. I mean, it's just sort of timing it right, and I think for Steve, with the beans that he's gotten from the Finland farm, he actually takes them to another part of the country that's where his son, so he can supply them. Yeah, so it's that.
And the thing with cacao, where it grows best, is not the best place to try it.
Yeah.
Right. When I do these tastings, I tell people, I focus most of my time on what happens on the farm, because to me, I think that's the most interesting. And some people have had tours of chocolate factories, so they know a little bit maybe about some, like a surface understanding. And when I say, and so you ferment and then you dry, and then I say, drying seems straightforward, and when you're in the tropics, it really isn't. You've got to be like bringing the beans in and out. You don't want them to get moldy, all of that kind of stuff, to help people understand that in itself is logistically and then skill-wise, as you're mentioning, pretty complex.